You know, I've been seeing these articles for decades now, highlighting how difficult dating is for Black women. And at the end of the day, when you really look at what they're saying, is that Black men's lives are so inconvenient to their dating that the fact that we die, go to jail, or whatever other structural issue is going on is secondary, if not tertiary, to her dating market. And get the What's good, y'all? Welcome back to the Onyx Report, Black Masculinist news for the day. And yeah, man, we got to get on something that has been getting on my nerves, and they're still doing it. But before we jump into that, y'all know the deal. Like, share, subscribe, join, and donate if you will. Support the channel. You can do so in all kinds of ways: Patreon, YouTube, PayPal, Venmo. Support so that we can continue bringing you the content that only Black male content creators can bring. Yeah. Anyway, also don't forget to also support the Institute for Black Male Studies. We got in, new batch of shirts that I think you guys might like. Black Men Matter shirts. We got the Frederick Douglass. We got Tommy Curry, and we got the new line that's been going that's been blowing up pretty well. I am a Black Masculinist, apparel. So support if you will, so that we can get the word out, most particularly to other brothers, about what's going on. So today we're going to look at a piece that is listed in newsone.com entitled Righteous Discontent. Righteous Discontent: Why Single Black Women Who Want to Be Married Are Not More Broken Than Anyone Else. Black women are ensnared by interlocking social structures that render them single for far longer than they intend, with fewer intra-racial dating options, theologian and author Ekemini Yuan writes. Yeah, and I probably mispronounced that name, but I do have to say that looking at this, my suspicion is there's the ADOS definition of flat blackness that may be going on here, where you have international kind of issues being flattened into an ADOS FBA kind of framework, and that kind of obscures the discussion a bit. But let's delve in and see what they're talking about. Kind of like Insecure, you just got a mixture of, African American, second generation African issues just kind of conflated. And one thing they all seem to share in common is a healthy disdain for Black men, which is something that I think we need to call attention to. Nevertheless, this piece begins. Much has been said on the subject of single Black women, our marriageability rates, and the abysmal dating pool available to us. You might even say too much has been said about all of this, but I have yet to hear the perspective of one who is perpetually single like myself. Now, there's already a sly diss to Black men in this piece, and it ain't been one sentence. And this is written by Ekemini Yuan herself, right? Theologian in question. So, there's no shortage of people within and outside our community telling us that our standards are too high and how we need to be high value women or settle for whoever shows us a modicum of attention. So another low key dig at Black men here, targeted at Kevin Samuels, right? So here we go. Just to put this in context, I've had a couple of at least 40 to 50 years of Black women in popular culture telling men that they need to improve, they need to meet their level, they need to be six-figure earners. They have to step it up essentially. And it's only been in the last couple of years, as far as mainstream is the mainstream is concerned, it's only been a couple of years where Black men have said, wait a minute, what? And pushed back. So we've been hearing this for generations now, but it's only been in the last years that we've started to push back against this notion. And she's already demonstrating the frustration that some Black women have about this whole question of what they need to bring. Because we've never talked about what Black women need to bring. We've only talked about what Black men need to do. So this conversation has only really started in the last couple of years, and you can see the frustration, the rage, all of that being brought to bear in this situation. All right. So as if that weren't enough, it seems like mainstream media can't get enough of this subject either. In the early 2000s, there was a flood of exposés on all major U.S. news outlets about the single Black female, which is often focused on the question, why can't successful Black women find a man? Now, these are deceptive questions. And first of all, she's being disingenuous. This issue, this trend of focusing on single black women goes back to at least the 70s. This is not new. This didn't start in the early 2000s by any measure. And the angle that many of these discussions took were always slanted against black men. Black men were the problem. Black men were the bane of black women's existence. They were the reason black women were frustrated. There, and very little of it actually focused on what black men were talking about or experiencing, which is interesting, because when black men finally do speak up, everybody's pissed, everybody's enraged, but we haven't been able to respond in decades. And so what she's doing here has been the most consistent approach to this issue. She's not breaking from it at all. Blaming black men has been a tradition in these kind of pieces for decades. And I'm talking about everything from articles like this to talk shows. This is not new. Actually, what she's doing is quite typical, right? And also I should say, this whole question of successful black women, it obscures the data. It really obscures reality. It's just like Rebecca Lynn Pope here on YouTube saying a few weeks ago that black women are running circles around black men. But again, if you go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics data, from 18 to 65, black men still earn more than they do. And that's despite not receiving any help. Nobody develops programs to any significant degree that gives resources and opportunities to black men. Those programs, if they exist, and they give resources to black men or opportunities, they're not targeted at black men. They're targeted in some generic fashion, whether it be black on the basis of race, whether it be men on the basis of just being, men, and even those are rare, if any. But you're not going to find any significant number of opportunities that are openly targeted specifically to black men. And we've talked about that a lot on this channel. So y'all know we point out the programs that are earmarked just for black women. You have programs earmarked for women. You have programs earmarked for black people that are overwhelmingly targeted to women, even though that's not the rhetoric of the language of the organization. And then you have programs targeted specifically for black women. You don't see that for black men. Even the generic programs don't go out their way to target black men. Right? So this whole question of successful black women is a misnomer. Yes, they go to college more. Yes, they're more readily employed, but they're still, they're not paid well by and large, especially in comparison to white women. And statistically, when you don't factor in incarceration, black men earn more. Employed black men are actually doing better than black women. It's when we factor in incarceration that those numbers go down. So it's actually a much more nuanced conversation. But of course, when you're talking to, these kind of women that aspire to this type of class superiority framework, they don't want to deal with any of the nuance. And when they do try to deal with the pay differential, they try to cast it as patriarchy in terms of why black men earn more, without regarding the fact that patriarchy, as we understand it in the West, hyper targets black men. It doesn't benefit black men. Patriarchy is not a benefit to black men. It targets black men. Think about it this way. When you think about Western patriarchy, it's safe to put that in the context of enslavement. Slave owners, that's Western patriarchy. Were they more or less aggressive about dealing with black men? Right? So black men don't benefit from patriarchy. They're hyper-targeted due to it. Anyway, much of the reporting devolved into paternalistic advice, false assertions about black pathology, and overworn stereotypes about the strong black independent woman. See, they're stereotypes. But when she stereotypes black men, we got to accept that. But the pushback black men finally begin to give, she immediately dismisses as nothing more than paternalistic advice and false assertions of black pathology. See, here's the problem. At what point are we actually able to talk about not just, black women's attitudes? That's just a generic kind of thing. We actually got to talk about shaped behavior over decades of policy access that men don't get. Right? So you're talking about families where girls have grown up watching their mothers and their grandmothers as heads of households, perceiving men as replaceable and disposable. Because in many ways, black men have been socialized to be that way. We've been institutionally treated that way. And many of us have developed and thrived against that type of treatment. Not because we were supported by anyone or anything institutionally. Many of us are pushing against that narrative despite a lack of support. But at the end of the day, we still suffer from the realities of this environment. Right? And that being said, when you start to look at the shaped behavior of many black women, the perception of black men, the in-baked misandry and hatred, or it's really what misandry is, right? Hatred for black men that is so baked into our culture, we don't even regard it as such. And when men finally start to point it out, because here's the thing, many of us have grown up feeling it. It's a low level, you know what, it's almost like eating, like if you ate oatmeal every day and there's a little bit of rat poison in, not necessarily enough to kill you, but enough to make your stomach turn just every time you eat it, but you're told to eat it every day. And after a while, you just calculate that your stomach hurting is just part of what happens when you eat mama's oatmeal. That's what we got. That's what black men experience. It's a low, and Kevin Samuels himself used to call it out, right? One-way aggression was one of the ways he talked about it. The one-way aggression toward black men in the community, that was acceptable. But when black men respond, it was considered hateful, misogynistic, and so on and so forth. But the other way he described it, right, was so it was one-way aggression. And oh man, what was the other way? There was two ways he described the low boiling contempt, right? The low level contempt for black men. And he's really talking about the same thing both ways, but he was still identify what I'm talking about here. So it's a daily consuming of poison. And now you have black men who will fight you over identifying that poison as poison. Mama would never poison my oatmeal. Boy, you've been eating poison your whole life. And here's the thing. It's gotten to the point where you have generations of black women that know to put rat poison. And of course, I'm speaking in an allegory here. They know to put rat poison in your oatmeal, but they no longer even process it as poison. It's just one of the ingredients. And that's what we're talking about here. And this is what she's doing in this article. She's participating in poisoning the well about black men because it's been standardized in our community. It's acceptable. What's not acceptable is for black men to call it out and point the finger back at you to say, well, you know what? We've heard for 50 years how we're the problem. Let's talk about what you bring to this dynamic. Oh my God, that's oppressive. Oh my God, you've mischaracterized me. It's black pathology. No, it's a two-way conversation that's only just been made two-way in the last couple of years. Ain't that some shit? I'm almost 50 and I've grown up hearing this most of my life. We've had 2 years of black men speaking out in the mainstream and all hell done broke loose. But y'all didn't have to sit through 40 years of programming, books, movies, TV shows, talk shows, reality shows, over and over with the same narrative of black men ain't shit. And this article just came out and it sounds like it was written in 1989. Same script. Ain't unchanged. Let's continue. Let me see. Not unlike a frog cut open during a middle school science experiment, black women were prodded, poked, sliced, and examined like specimens as our interior lives were dissected under the microscope of America's paternalism. Remember, she's talking about the last 2 years with Kevin Samuels. See what I mean? You got, this is the funny part. You got one brother on YouTube who built his show with no significant backing from any one entity. There are no corporations that funded him. There are no Hollywood news studios that funded him. One guy on YouTube who comes out of a community of men talking, all of whom built their channels on their own with no support. And I'm saying that as one of them. Ain't nobody funded this outside of the subscribers, but there's no entity behind many of us. Many of us are doing this on our own. And Kevin was one of those men. And yet she's talking like he's Oprah. Like he done made decades of films, put out books, and has his own TV channel that somehow and it has global impact. She's talking about black men and Kevin in particular, as if he has the pull and weight of black women in media. And you're talking about 2 years on YouTube. Oh, excuse me. And Instagram. This is some disingenuous shit right here. It really is. The preponderance of such reporting, seemingly intractable statistics, which reveal that 62% of black women like myself are more likely to be unpartnered, and the convergence of my experience as lifelong single black woman who desires to be married to a black man has stirred up within me a righteous discontent. She's going to call her own discontent righteous. Okay. To borrow the prescient phrase from Nanny Helen Burroughs, I posit that black women who desire to be married yet find themselves single are not more broken than anyone else on the dating market, and I categorically reject the idea that our single status is due to some pathological phenomenon within the black community, as some researchers, journalists, and pundits have suggested. Rather, black women are ensnared by interlocking social structures that render them single for far longer than they intend, with fewer intraracial dating options. Now, here's the thing. I agree and disagree at the same time. I do believe there are issues that are structural that impact black women. And many of them are secondary impacts as they impact black men first, right? When black men go to prison in higher numbers, that has a structural impact on black families and, yes, on black women. But again, it's secondary because it primarily impacts black men. We could talk about the same thing in terms of homicide. We could talk about the same things in terms of health. Black men suffer these things first. They have a secondary impact on black women. But part of what's been missing from this discussion for decades is the conversation about what exactly black women could do better. And that's not been part of the discussion. This is one of the things that Kevin symbolized. You know, he became a touch point for, but it was coming out of a much larger discussion that he didn't start. He just introduced it to the mainstream. But that was the question that we've never had. We've never had that conversation in the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s. We never had the conversation. We've heard under the table. Hell, even when I was in elementary school, us young brothers were talking about black girls' attitudes. But it's more than that. That's what we talk about on this channel. It's not just attitudes. It's a worldview that's shaped based off of a series of experiences that are institutionally sanctioned, from welfare to college access to employment to so on and so forth. When those resources are brought to bear in a consistent fashion for black women and not black men, what is the attitude? What is the worldview that is shaped over decades, generations? How does she perceive black men? How does she teach her daughter and her granddaughter and her great-granddaughter to perceive black men, not in just what she says, but also what she does? I talked about this before, even big mamas of the family, right? Where everybody talks about Big Mama's house and what role Big Mama played. But they often ignore and deny the husband that put her in that damn house and died 20 years prior, 30 years prior. The role of black men has become myth. Even when black men put black women into positions of security, they're not even remembered in families. We become invisible, persona non grata, as if we've had nothing to do with what has gone well in black communities, particularly for black women. How many black men put black women through schools? And I'm not even just talking about fathers and stepfathers. I'm talking about boyfriends and husbands, so on and so forth. None of that gets regarded. Anyway. So yeah, I think dealing with black women's worldviews and their behavior, right? Their perceived behavior. Again, if you promote this goddess syndrome, which is the level of narcissism that this has reached at this point, right? That, you know, they're goddesses, you know, they're queens, and we're drones, we're worker drones, we're warrior drones. You rarely hear them talking about if you're a goddess, he's the god. If you're the queen, he's your king. You don't hear that in the black community. You hear her being queen, you're her being goddess. You just kind of there to make her feel good. You answer the phone when she calls you. You know, that's the kind of dynamic we hear. We don't hear it as a two-way street as from black women, especially in media, social media included. We don't hear that. It's a one-way discussion about her ascendancy and you're along for the ride if you're lucky. Right? But she doesn't have to be accountable for her behavior or her treatment or her perspective as black men is nothing more than footstools to work on her behalf. And if every black woman is not guaranteed the black man of their dreams, niggas a trifle. This woman here hasn't even said anything yet about what exactly she's done other than be single. But her entitlement about what she deserves and her righteous discontent about what she doesn't have. Right? This is why the conversation started in the manosphere is so important, because the question, again, popularized by Kevin Samuels, was, okay, what exactly have you identified that the men you want? Well, how dare you ask us that? No, it's overdue, because we've been asked for decades. Do you know what women want? Well, in case you don't know, here's the list. And we've heard this list since the 80s. 6-figure income, 6 foot tall, 6-pack, abs, so on and so forth. Don't live with your mama, have your own house, have your own car, be able to pay for me, take care of me. My money is my money. Your money is our money. We've heard these narratives for decades. None of those women asked what men want. They just assumed that as long as she had a big butt and a smile, or as long as she existed, that was supposed to be enough. She can have a list down the street, but you need to take what you're given. meaning any woman that shows interest to you, you're browbeaten into accepting because that's what you're supposed to do. But if you actually, as a man, have desires, have standards, have things you want in place, they're automatically considered a precedent. And it's a problem. Because for years we were told not to have standards. We were told that you were just supposed to follow. Bullshit. Okay? I share my story of singleness merely as a vignette of what it's like to be a black woman ensnared by structural mechanisms of mass incarceration, colorism, and desirability mapped onto me and other black women whose dating experiences track with black heteronormative dating patterns. This is my story. This is my song. I'm 30-something, single black woman. I have never been in a dating relationship. I've never had a boyfriend. I've never brought anyone home to meet my family. I've never even been pursued or sought after. In my early 20s, people thought my singleness was endearing. In my late 20s, endearment gave way to bewilderment and morphed into mystification. And in my mid 30s, mystification produced shame. In my late 30s, shame has transformed into anger. Yeah, and that has nothing to do with repelling men. Because at no point in this diatribe did you actually talk about why you wanted a man and what type of man you want and why he should want to be with you. You just talked about why you didn't have one, or just you didn't even talk about why. You just talked about the fact that you didn't have one. The why was somehow irrelevant. Could it be that there is actually something we have to talk about your worldview and the way you perceive men? Because even in what I'm hearing here, you've objectified men as being stand-ins to your fantasies. They're just supposed to be there. They're supposed to pursue you. They're supposed to make you feel better about yourself simply because they pursue you. At no point did you talk about yourself in terms of what exactly is worth it about you that a man should do all of this. See, here's the thing. Even as early as 4th grade, when I figured out that I might have wanted a girlfriend, it became very clear that I had to do things differently to have a girlfriend. I had to dress a certain way. I had to bathe on a regular basis. Those weren't priorities to me in 4th grade. I wanted to play. Recess, that was it. But the moment I decided I might want a girlfriend, there were things that I was told I needed to do to satisfy the interests of girls and then later women. Does she sound like she's even aware of any of that? What exactly do men want? And this is the question that men have been actually talking about lately that has so many women so upset, because we've never really talked about it before. She says, honestly, I'm not sure how it happened. My perpetual state of singleness is an enigma. It's an enigma. Word. See, that to me sounds like somebody who actually hasn't been told what her issues are. She hasn't had a man sit down and tell her, these are the things that men want. Because they don't want to hear that. They want to hear, I just exist and men want me. And if that doesn't happen, men are the problem. Doesn't work that way. It's kind of like losing weight. There's a science to losing weight. There really is. I've lost about 60 pounds so far. I'm going through this process and I'm understanding it. You cannot eat junk every day. You cannot eat what you feel like eating every day and still lose weight. You have to learn the science of losing weight, and you can't be mad at the fact that you're not following through and the results aren't coming. You actually at some point have to say, okay, look, if I really want to lose weight, I got to understand the science of what I need to do right in order to lose weight. And black women like this, they understand that when it comes to everything else except black men. She's not saying, okay, if I want a man, I got to understand the science of what men want. She's not doing that. She's complaining. I'm eating cheeseburgers every day and I'm not losing weight. Damn these cheeseburgers. Forget them. I'm still going to eat them, but I'm mad. But you don't want to study why you're not losing weight. That's essentially what she's doing. Right? A lot of blaming, a lot of complaining, not a lot of self-reflection. She says, it's not for lack of trying. I'm certainly not a hermit. I travel, work out, take in festivals, enjoy concerts, and attend academic lectures to satisfy my intellectual curiosity. None of that said anything about men's interest. Right? None of that. I want a woman. I go to football games. I go to martial arts training with the fellas. I read books in my living room, but I can't find a woman. Word. Well, maybe that's because women aren't necessarily as interested in those things, and they don't show up in as high numbers as needed for you to actually meet women. But see, men understand that. If you want to meet a woman, you probably got to go to where women are, and you probably got to address women's interests. She just listed a bunch of shit she likes to do. Anyway, I participated in an early iteration of online black dating back when the general consensus was that online dating was weird. I was on eHarmony, Match.com, Black People Meet, and Black Planet. just gonna tell you, it's a red flag. You've been doing this that long, where you go back to Black People Meet and Black Planet, and you ain't interacted with nobody, you ain't dated before. Starting to look suspicious. When dating apps became the norm, I moved with the times and downloaded a few of those apps on my phone, where they remain as I write this because I'm still single. Now is a good time as any to say that dating apps are a special kind of hell on their own, and I would not wish them on my worst enemy. Despite online dating apps, and my friends' well-intentioned matchmaking attempts, these efforts have only ever resulted in situationships. Surely you know what situationships are, and if you don't, perhaps you're unwittingly experienced one. You've unwittingly experienced one. Situationships are those faux relationships that revolve on an axis of gray, refusing to be black or white, constrained by an unspoken mutual attraction, and enmeshed with all the anxiety and heartbreak that comes with a relationship. Yet after enduring situationships in the typical 4 to 6 month installments, and in some cases even a year, heartbreak and sorrow, even without the girlfriend title, were the only evidence that something had transpired each time. When I read Diane M. Stewart's Black Women, Black Love, America's War on African American Marriage, I felt seen in her descriptions of the systemic forces working against us. Stewart lays out the issue masterfully when she says, most heterosexual Black women in America today, whether parenting offspring or not, are single by circumstance, not by choice. The trouble is not with Black women failing to value marriage. It is the shrinking demographic of those who Black women want to marry. Right. But we know 80% of divorces are initiated by women. So it has nothing to do with a lack of valuing marriage, right? Okay. In some cases, Black women lack dating prospects within their socioeconomic group, and in other cases, they don't have any dating prospects at all. No, that's not the problem. We've talked about this in the manosphere for some years now. The problem isn't that you lack dating options. The problem is the options you have available to you do not meet your standards, and your standards do not necessarily match what you bring to the table. But again, that would mean you'd actually have to be accountable for your own behavior, and we clearly can't have that. She characterizes Black women's lack of opportunities for love and marriage with Black men as the nation's most hidden and thus neglected civil rights issue to date. Oh, Jesus. Stewart provides the historical receipts that reveal Black love as a contested site in this nation, and details the way that the war on African American marriage was waged in the past and present. Let me say this. I'm actually seeing young Black men from the age of 13 to 65 who have withdrawn from the dating pool. This is some unprecedented shit. When teenagers, when middle schoolers are withdrawing from the dating market, and that doesn't change through college. Do you know how many young college men reach out to me? You know how many young men in high school have reached out to me? Men from 13 to 65 who are like, I'm done. I'm either going international, interracial, I'm going monk. This has not been heard of before. If you have men across age, across class, across occupation, who are withdrawing from the dating market, yet you still want to categorize this as a structural issue when you are the secondary beneficiary of the structures you're talking about, second to Black men themselves who have to experience it, then maybe there's an aspect of this problem that has to do with your worldview, particularly on the men you claim to want. Undoubtedly, there are structural realities that have contributed to my singleness. Now we're back to this, like mass incarceration. Now, that's the second time she done said that shit. Now, unless she'd been to prison and then tack that on to a significant number of Black women who are somehow comparable to Black men in terms of that, which hasn't ever happened, then she's only the secondary beneficiary of this type of structural issue. She said there are approximately 100 unimprisoned Black women to 91 unimprisoned Black men, according to Stewart. In 2015, Ta-Nehisi Coates shared a litany of harrowing statistics in The Atlantic, right? Black family in the age of mass incarceration. In 2001, and 10 Black males between the ages of 20 and 40 was incarcerated, 10 times the rate of their white peers. In 2010, a third of all Black male high school dropouts between the age of 20 and 39 were in prison, compared with only 13% of their white peers. 1 in 4 Black men born since the late 1970s has spent time in prison. In other words, in the year 2000, as I was entering college, one of the most viable ways to meet a suitable marriage partner, my Black male peers were entering cages all over this nation. True. However, I can also tell you as a university professor that those girls at 17, 18 coming into college were demanding six-figure incomes from the men they were going to school with. Those boys were first-generation college students in many instances. They were coming to colleges for the first time. 70% of them drop out nationwide within their first year. And the women that they were going to school with were demanding unreasonable standards of living then. Everybody there to get an education, but you demanding six figures from the kid that's sitting next to you in class. Word. But we're not going to talk about that. Because again, that would have to go back to some degree of accountability for your worldview. Even though I do believe that worldview has been shaped by policy, shaped by what we would call white supremacy. I think we need to be more particular to that. But we don't get to talk about that because we just have to blame black men for that. Additionally, colorism is an interracial dynamic that has played a role in my singleness. Researchers have found that dark-skinned black women like me are less likely to be married than our light-skinned counterparts. Dark-skinned black women are also disproportionately impacted by the depletion of the black male marriage pool. This point is underscored by Darrick Hamilton, Arthur H. Goldsmith, and William Darity Jr. in Shedding Light on Marriage, the influence of skin shade on marriage for black females. They found that 55% of light-skinned black women had been married, compared with only 23% of their dark-skinned counterparts. Inevitably, the issue of desirability is raised whenever the subject of singleness is on the table. But let me state for the record that desirability is a scam. Beauty or lack thereof does not determine if an individual will or won't be married. I think we know this intuitively, but due to our socialization, we continue to deceive ourselves into thinking that if we enhance, lighten, tighten, lift, plump, and then we will, will be desired, will be desirable and partner. Grew up I was born in the 70s. I grew up in the 80s. I grew up in the 80s era of Prince and Michael Jackson. I grew up in the era where I remember when black girls would tell you you were ugly because you were dark. And they would say that verbatim. I remember the time period when in school you'd be called names because you were dark. I remember watching girls skip over dark men for light men. I remember that whole time period. There was no empathy for dark-skinned black men then either. There wasn't. You just had to shut up and take it or improve on one level or another. You had to demonstrate prowess and mastery in some area that attracted attention. Well, hey. But at the end of the day, this whole question of, colorism being the sole, I think it's a lazy analysis. I think she's not actually factoring in that at the end of the day, you still have to fucking compete. And that's the end of it. It doesn't matter. You can talk about the drawbacks. And as for black men, I could definitely talk about our drawbacks in terms of challenges we have that make it difficult to compete in the marketplace. But nobody gives a damn. You still have to compete. And men understand that you have to compete. Many women that don't want to compete. Again, she's not talking about what she needs to do, what she has done. She's talked about everything she refuses to do, or everything she has to endure that's placed upon her. She's talked about nothing having to do with what she does to compete. Maybe she will in the latter part of the article, but she hasn't so far. But men understand, I got to compete. Men understand whether they like it or not. I got to find ways to look good, be creatively expressive. I got to make a certain amount of money. I got to be able to put myself in a certain amount of shape. And we like to dismiss these things as irrelevant. But again, if the quality of woman available to you is not the standard or not your standard, then men often are socialized to understand that you actually have to increase your social value to increase the quality of woman. And by increasing the quality of woman, I don't mean she has to make six figures and none of that bullshit. It means that she meets your standard, whatever that may be. But men are taught very early on that if that's what you want, you actually have to improve your social standing. Somehow women don't get that message, or at least women like her. I'm what people would classify as desirable. So now she's saying she is desirable despite being dark skinned and never having had a relationship. However, this was not always so. The world around me taught me that beauty did not belong to me. I wish I could tell you that I did not internalize the messages of undesirability during my adolescence, but that's simply not true. Especially as dark-skinned black girl turned black woman who was born and raised in California, beauty standards are not transnational, which is why my sweet mother would often remind me that my gap-toothed smile is a symbol of beauty back in her home country of Nigeria. But in my home country, the United States of America, it is not. As human beings, we gravitate toward beauty. We create beautiful things in the world, and that's a good thing. However, the way we commodify, compare, and manipulate beauty The way we contort and control beauty, creating structures of beauty that idolize some and malign others, a scam. Look, here's the thing. There's no standard of beauty that doesn't do that. I don't care where you are. If you're going to tell me that having a gap tooth smile in Nigeria is a standard of beauty, does that mean all women have gap tooth smiles? So what happens to those that don't? Do they get the benefits of the beauty standard? See, that's the thing. Wherever they are, beauty is based on what is often rare. It is what it is. There will never be a day where sand is going to be more valuable than diamonds. And a lot of it has to do with rarity. And, of course, there's information that, some of these corporations, these diamond corporations, created value for diamonds by making them rare, raising the cost, and eliminating options for how people could get them. But the point is, they may have manipulated the line, but the line is still the line. Value is determined by rarity. It is what it is. The same goes for men and women. Black men, most especially. Nobody gets a break. Nobody gets a break. You may win the genetic lottery, and you may have all of the ideas. You may embody the ideas of beauty in a given society, but she's right. It's not transnational. You go someplace else, not necessarily the case. Now, there are overarching standards there where, people might find you more attractive than ugly because of it. But at the end of the day, beauty is often shifting depending on where you are and the culture of that environment. But at the end of the day, you still have to compete if what you want is what you want. Whether it's, emotional maturity from a partner or wealth, whatever it is you want, in order for you to find the quality that you want in a given mate, you actually have to meet their standard. And if you don't bother to ask what that is, I tell people it's like, getting out of an airport, getting into a cab and telling the cab driver where not to go. Don't make a left. Don't turn right a mile forward. That doesn't get you where you want to go. At some point, in order for you to get where you got to get to, you got to do the research. You got to meet the standard to identify what it is you want. It's like if you're going fishing and you want to catch certain types of fish, you got to research what kinds of bait work for that fish. Otherwise, you're just throwing shit in the water and mad that you're not catching the exact type of fish you want. Doesn't work. Far-reaching tentacles of oppression via the transatlantic slave trade, chattel slavery, and mass incarceration have depleted the black male marriage market. Meanwhile, what's left of the market is further complicated by colorism and beauty hierarchies, leaving heterosexual black women who desire to be married to a black man single for far longer than they intend. And yet, I have multiple generations of black men, dark and light, well-to-do and poor, from different regions around the world, let alone the country, who are abstaining from relationships. And their reasoning for doing so is how they're treated by the women in our community, how they're perceived. Even men who are doing well, because I hear this shit too. Oh, well, that's just for men who aren't trying hard enough. No. I've had brothers who run banks. I have brothers who are university presidents who reach out to me and tell me stories about their situations, even with the women in their families. I got brothers who are successful worldwide, who go to other countries and over 60 different countries, walk the streets and they're mobbed like Michael Jackson, even though they're not recognized in the US. And they can tell you stories about how beloved family members, let alone lovers and wives, have treated them, regardless of their accomplishments and who they are. And they're starting to withdraw. So you can keep blaming these structures if you want, but nowhere in here did you talk about what exactly black women need to do differently, or whether or not there's an issue on the table for them. It's one thing for a black woman to choose singleness, which is their prerogative. Not everyone desires marriage. It's another thing entirely to desire marriage and to have your agency with regard to your marital status stripped away from you due to mechanisms of oppression that have been in motion for hundreds of years. Part of what it means to be fully human is to exercise our God-given agency. When this is stripped from us, injustice is afoot and righteous discontent is a reasonable response. And yet again, she's talking about structural issues that impact her secondarily. But instead of actually empathizing for the men who experience it on a first-hand basis, she actually joins in criticizing them. This is such bullshit. But I'm going to tell you my response to this piece. And I wrote this on Facebook, and I got to say, I still agree with it. I said, I would really like to interpret this in the spirit of a shared Black communal experience of oppression, but I don't sense it to be articulated that way. Interlocking social structures that render them single sound to me like crying about Black men's systemic trials merely hamper, or about, oh, excuse me, sorry about that. All right, I'll try that again. Interlocking social structures that render them single sound to me like crying about how Black men's systemic trials merely hamper women's dating options. This smacks of how inconvenient a Black man's incarceration or death makes a Black woman's prospects for being taken to a nice steak restaurant. It sounds inauthentic, narcissistic, and self-absorbed, and I'm tired of it. I'm sick of decades of such reporting of Black men's systemic struggles being watered down to the annoying and inconvenient impact it has on women's dating and mating woes. It's incredibly dismissive and pandering at best and diabolically misandric at worst. We don't just exist to be boyfriends and sperm donors, stepfathers and unpaid bodyguards, or worse yet, mannequin-like props to be used in her lifelong imagined wedding, the wedding she opts for over the actual marriage because she never actually wanted to be married in the first place. She just wanted the white dress, the ceremony, and the ring, with him footing the bill, by the way, right? And when the divorce comes, fellas, that's just incidental, right? That's nothing to be taken seriously. Black women are ensnared by interlocking social structures that render them single for far longer than they intend, with fewer interracial dating options, she says. And then she continues on, about sharing her story. But my response to this is essentially that this is ridiculous and it's arrogant. And the one thing I will say that this article has added to the decades-long maligning of Black men and misreporting of our experiences, she actually appropriates Black men's structural issues and she makes it about Black women. That's the interesting thing about this article. This is the only new component that I've seen added to this decades long narrative of Black women struggling, right, in relation to dating and mating. Again, you haven't asked Black men shit. And when Black men started speaking up, there was all kinds of rage about what they had to say, which she only, dismisses without even addressing with any kind of particularity or specificity. But the one thing she did add is to now fully appropriate the structural issues that first impact Black men without acknowledging that it impacts them, without empathizing that it impacts them, without even talking about the structural reasons it impacts them. Shout out to Jim Sidanius. She absorbs them and appropriates them and makes them Black women's bane of existence. And yet Black men are still somehow responsible. See, this is the game that's being played. This is why this article is posted on News One and not just on her blog somewhere. But anyway, this is the kind of bullshit we up against. And that's why I entitled this video, "We Die, But They Can't Date." Because that's essentially how this is being reported. The issues that affect Black men in a very realistic way, that had over 1.5 million Black men missing a couple of years ago, is now conveniently portrayed by Black women in media as inconvenient to her dating options. Anyway, look forward to hearing what y'all have to think about this. Hope y'all are well. Peace.